Okay, so it's gone past the hour. Let us begin. I'll start off with a quick introduction. My name's Alastair Campbell. I'm a Director of Accessibility in Nomensa. I'm co-chair and / editor of the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, which I will explain more about later. And today was very much kind of an introductory overview of accessibility, particularly aimed at people in organizations who may not have done much on accessibility before, being fairly new to it and wondering where to start and what to do next. We did run a benchmarking report in the Netherlands recently, so that's partly where this sort of webinar came from, but even if you didn't hear anything about that, this will hopefully be a useful digital accessibility overview. So I better start off with defining what that means. I kind of define digital accessibility like usability. So how easy is it for somebody with an access need to use your product? Where accessibility varies from usability is that there are many more types of interaction that people can have, whether that's due to technologies like screen magnifiers, readers, voice input, or whether it's due to cognition. People might look at a product and interpret it differently. And there's actually so many different ways people can interact with things. That's where the platform standards become really useful. So that's the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or if you're developing apps, that would be things like the iOS or Android Accessibility Guidelines. And it's really worth sort of realizing that a disability is very much a kind of mismatched interaction. So on screen, I've got something from the Microsoft Inclusive Design Toolkit, and they have various sort of examples of permanent, temporary, and situational disabilities. So for example, somebody who's blind, if you create an interface that works with somebody who's blind, that's a similar sort of interface, different name maybe, to somebody who is driving and can't look at a screen. So it's very much more audio-based, input and output. And so a lot of the times we're focusing on accessibility, and we are making kind of more robust products. And it's often in websites and applications an invisible attribute. It's something that if you don't have a disability, you wouldn't necessarily be able to look at a website and understand whether it's accessible or not. So just as an example, I'll start off with mobility. Hopefully people recognize Stephen Hawkins, I've got a picture of. And he used software called Switch Access, which would run through all the options on the page. And you, in his case, would twitch a muscle in his cheek or press a button. So if you can't use a mouse, you're using a very keyboard-like interface. It's quite a mainstream technology now. It's built into iOS since version 7, and it's on other platforms as well. And if I took two identical looking websites, apologies, I've used Nomensa.com, it's mostly because I don't mind manipulating our own website. And if I start tabbing through, just trigger the video, hopefully this works. On the left-hand video, we see an outline appearing around the links, which is the signifier of your keyboard focus. It gets down to the bottom. And then on the right-hand side, I could be doing the same thing now, but the site can hide that outline as you go through the website, rendering it very inaccessible. There are lots of other ways you can make things inaccessible for people with mobility impairments, so certain things wouldn't work, not just being hidden. But just getting the principle across that unless you actually start tabbing through a page, you wouldn't know if it was going to be accessible or not to somebody with mobility impairment. If I take low vision as another example and simulate a sort of vision impairment, I've blurred the screenshots just to simulate a kind of moderate visual impairment. And then what really helps people if your vision isn't great is being able to zoom in. So I'm going to kind of show you two ways that can work. On the left-hand side, we zoom in and the whole website reflows. So this is what happens if you use a responsive web design. You zoom in with a desktop browser and it will show you a nice big clear version, and everything fits to the width. That's because people have probably taken on board mobile, making things work on mobile. Whereas on the right-hand side, when we zoom in, it's not responsive. We have a very kind of magnifier-orientated experience. So we're having to horizontally scroll as well as vertically scroll. So everything's bigger, at least when we zoom in. But imagine trying to kind of read like this. Imagine having to sway back and forth just to read lines of text, because you need things that size. That's a pretty terrible experience. And screen readers come in various shapes and sizes. This is a Braille display hooked up to a standard Windows laptop running JAWS. But I think most people kind of associate screen readers with the voice output. Just going to share my computer sound. And again, this is just a quick example of how a screen reader would come across. Apologies if the volume is much greater or lower. I don't seem to have control of that, but here we go, just as an example of a screen reader on this website. Let's try it.
Visited link. Nomensa. Return to the home page. Main menu. Link. Our work. Link. What we do. Link. Careers. Link. Blog. Visited link. Contact us. Heading level 1. Nomensa. Strategic experience design. We are humanizing technology. Play video button. We deliver experience excellence and connect brands to their customers through our human-centric approach. Heading level 2. Great design starts here. We create groundbreaking experiences. Visited link.
Hopefully you noticed that we've got structure in the page. If we look at the left-hand side, I've kind of stripped back the design and added in some little structural indicators like banner, nav, heading 1, and the heading 2s. So we are conveying certain important aspects of the design, whereas on the right-hand side, that's just without styles. So it's all the text on the page, but it's a very basic text-only version without the structure. And that's very much the difference that you can get between a site that might look as you want it to do, but one can be accessible, one can be inaccessible. So moving on to the guidelines, we've got the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, and where do they come from? Well, going back to the mid to late 90s, there were quite a few countries around the world considering making accessibility guidelines for the web, which would have led to big companies like Microsoft and Adobe and Google, if it was around then, having to fulfill different requirements in different parts of the world. So that's where the World Wide Web Consortium came in. That's Tim Berners-Lee, who I would say shepherd standards like HTML, CSS, and the accessibility guidelines. And when we start looking at the kind of accessibility guidelines, I'm sure everyone's aware of, you have a website, each person is using a browser. We kind of expand that term to user agent because it can include more than browsers. And then, we've got, I've still got my Internet Explorer icon. I should replace that with Edge soon. Things like Chrome, Firefox, Safari, Edge, and everyone who's done browser testing knows that can be quite difficult when different browsers behave differently. When you add on all of the different assistive technologies, so I've put in a smattering, a small selection of possible technologies like screen readers, JAWS, NVDA, VoiceOver, switch access inputs. We've got Dragon is a common voice input. Zoom magnifier. So we've got all these different ones, and actually they work differently with different browsers. Some of them used in conjunction with others used on their own. It makes browser testing look very simple. You simply can't take a device approach to testing a website for accessibility. So the W3C formed a group and started looking at guidelines, and these guidelines came from various sources. So usability testing, surveys, research, people with disabilities, just saying, we keep coming across this issue. How do we prevent that? There is a filter on these guidelines. So they have to be feasible for people to implement. They need to apply across technologies, so things like PDFs, EPUB, etc. And they need to be able to apply to all websites. You can't have a guideline that only applies to big websites or small websites. They have to apply fairly universally. And we've got several versions. So version 1 came out in 99, version 2 in 2008, version 2.1, which built on version 2, came out a couple of years ago. So digging in a little bit, what is a guideline? Well, I try and describe them as antibodies almost. And I came up with this analogy well before our current coronavirus situation. But each guideline is trying to track down and prevent a particular known barrier. So poor color contrast is a known barrier, so there's a guideline for that. And they try and sort of only find those things. And what that does mean is that there are some things that will cause accessibility issues that may not be covered by a guideline because it's difficult to come up with a guideline to catch just that issue. So when you think about guidelines, one way of thinking about it would be to say, well, I know screen readers navigate by headings. So we should have a guideline that says you have to use headings. Except that that doesn't actually apply universally very easily. It also means that somebody who's doing the testing would have to know about headings, how screen readers use them, and it implies a lot more knowledge and a method of testing that isn't necessarily appropriate everywhere. So the way the guidelines work is to identify sort of aspects of the content that you can look at and say, does it pass or fail? And this is one of the more complicated ones, but it's saying information structure and relationships conveyed through presentation can be programmatically determined or are available in text. And that's more vague in some ways, sort of understandably, but it is much more testable. You can kind of say, oh, well, what is this thing? It's designed in a certain way. What is the appropriate structure for that thing? So if it looks like a heading, it should be conveyed as a heading, for example. There are principles, guidelines and success criteria, but what I would say is that when we talk about guidelines, those top two are just categories. When people say guidelines, we mean the success criteria, which is a testable statement that is known to improve access for people with disabilities. And I'm guilty of it myself. I will always generally call them guidelines, even though we mean success criteria. They come under various levels. Level A means critical. Some people won't be able to access the content. AA is essential. Significant barriers would remain. And AAA is useful, possibly essential to some. But basically, the harder the barrier is to overcome, the higher up those levels it will be. But the more difficult it is to implement, the lower it would come. Or if it doesn't apply to all content, it might just tuck in at AAA because it can't be applied to all websites. And if it requires a change to the look and feel, that would also potentially push it down the levels as well. So those are just kind of rules of thumb. It's basically a consensus process in a working group that defines that level. So how does testing accessibility work? Well, we've got a few methods. We've got testing with people. So you get a variety of people with disabilities in, sit down, test a website, which, as I said earlier, is actually where the guidelines came from. Now, those guidelines are then used as a foundation for automated testing. And also there are certain review tools. So as a experienced or even sort of not very experienced accessibility person, you can open a page, use something like Wave or one of the other tools, and it will try and highlight issues for you. Now, usability testing is kind of the gold standard. It's very good for testing live sites, prioritizing issues, learning about accessibility, and getting buy-in from stakeholders who can see problems happening. But I would say it's not so good for site-wide coverage. So even in-page coverage, somebody going through a particular path, doing a task, isn't going to go through a whole page. And you're certainly not going to go through all the pages on the website. Testing with guidelines is good, especially at the later stages of development. You can get very good coverage if you get a sample of different templates, different content types, and it tends to be sort of the best way of saying I've done my bit, filling in accessibility statements, which we'll come on to, and just sort of having a good sort of proof that you have been through a website. It does take some experience though. And then automated testing is very good for wide coverage, pointing it at a whole website or integrating with the build process as you go along with your developers. But it's not great for depth of coverage in terms of guidelines. So it doesn't cover all the guidelines. There are some that it just doesn't cover at all, and there are some which will find some issues, but it can't say you've passed. So just to sort of represent that, I've got this graph on screen, which has got a small thick block for automated testing, showing that you get really good kind of site-wide coverage, that's the vertical axis, but not very good coverage of the guidelines. A manual audit, which is quite a thick block, that's good for testing to the guidelines. And then usability testing with people with disabilities will get you full range of issues, but for a smaller segment of the website. Okay, so that's how we do testing. How does that fit in with the legislation? So this does vary by country, and we've got a multinational audience today. So in terms of legal goalposts, it very much depends at the moment on where you are and what sector you're in. So in the UK, we have the Equalities Act, which basically says if you provide a product or service, it should not discriminate. Generally, that means the website should be accessible. It doesn't always. You might provide your product or service in other ways. There are, for public sector bodies across the EU, a requirement to meet AA accessibility to the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines and publish an accessibility statement to that effect as well, which needs to outline if you haven't met it as well. There is also an EU procurement directive, and I think later on there is the EU have been currently in the process of creating another accessibility directive that would be more aimed at commercial organizations. So for the public sector, sorry, this is public sector bodies. I just wanted to say, I'd already said it, sorry, on the previous slide, but basically you do need to understand your website's accessibility, fix issues, and provide details of this in an accessibility statement. This is a strict requirement, although given the current coronavirus situation, it may well be the enforcement of this is not so urgent, because the deadline is September 2020 for all public sector websites to be accessible and publishing their statement. And we've got a bit longer for mobile apps. We've got till June next year. But if this hasn't been on your radar and you work in a public sector organization, this very much should be on your radar. The accessibility statement is supposed to be updated annually, list any parts that aren't accessible, provide links to alternatives, provide a feedback mechanism, and link to the enforcement procedure. There are, for the Netherlands and for the UK, there are templates that you can use, but it does mean you have to get your site tested in order to fill that in. If you're in a commercial organization, there are quite a few procurement laws. So if you sell to the public sector, the requirements are going to be very similar to the ones I've just spoken about. And if you sell in countries like the US and Canada, they are quite litigious, at least in the US. And I think Canada has some very strict laws. We've got clients who've opened up their site to sort of Canadian to the Canadian public and were told in no uncertain terms they did need to make it accessible. And this was, I can't name names, but it was a commercial organization that provides food delivery, should we say. And as I said before, there is also a proposal for an EU law that covers some commercial products and services, especially around banking and travel. So, what should your next steps be? Well, I don't know. I don't know if you have sort of had a look through accessibility things so far. According to our benchmarking, we got in touch with quite a number of organisations in the Netherlands, and about 50% of respondents from organisations had taken no action. So, and we asked also about, whether they had sort of UX expertise or processes in place, and almost all did. It was only 13% who didn't invest in UX. But so we see quite a big difference between accessibility and UX in that sense. And from about 20 years experience now working in accessibility, when I go into an organization, it's fairly easy to see what level of maturity they're at. And I've got a sort of typical maturity scale. I actually prefer my accessibility maturity scale, which is where people or organizations rather are starting, if at a point where they don't know what they don't know. Seems like about 50% of organizations are in that position at the moment. Some have a little bit of knowledge, either in small pockets or spread out. Some have started working on like an accessibility program, but they might be feeling overwhelmed. And then organizations at a good level have it integrated. It's just part of the process. And then I've got a sort of highest level of kind of Zen accessibility, which is where, it's all baked in and you're actually pushing the field forward. There's a couple of organizations we've worked with like that. And I just wanted to run through some typical things I hear in organizations that you need to watch out for. For example, I talked to a project manager or product owner saying, oh, it must be accessible. We asked our outsourced developers to meet WCAG. The problem is, what tends to happen is you hire an agency for a project, you do the project, you release it to the public, and then you get a complaint, and you realize nobody actually tested it or knew how to test against those guidelines. So it's a case of often the buyer and the seller actually not knowing what that requirement was, even though both agreed to it. And that gets contractually quite difficult. Also, I hear, well, we use this shiny framework, take your pick. That means it must be accessible, right? Well, no, even if it was a framework that had put a lot of effort into accessibility, so on the right-hand side of this graph, there's always going to be a gap, which is how it's implemented. So on the left-hand side of the graph, actually most frameworks haven't put much effort into accessibility. So there is a lot to do for the developers in accessibility terms. Some frameworks are quite neutral. It doesn't sort of matter one way or the other, but then the developers have to know how to use it. But the bottom line is you can't rely on a framework. I also get a lot of sort of product owners assuming that designers and developers must get taught accessibility. It's like they have an architectural kind of mental framework. They're thinking, builders and architects have to kind of meet certain accessibility criteria, such as ramps and things. They must get, designers, developers must get taught this as well. I run lots of training, and the very short answer is no. There's maybe 30% or no, it's more like 1 in 10 people. So I always start off a training session, who's done anything on accessibility before? And the answer is maybe 1 in 10. Developers need to know where to get good source code. So as a developer, if you're creating a component, carousel, navigation, whatever, the chances are you're going to grab that code from somewhere, modify it, and use it for your purposes. If you start with something that's accessible, that makes a massive difference. But the developers have to know to do that. quite often if QA is a source of accessibility knowledge, we tend to get a bottleneck. So if it's not accounted for before that point, you will have requirements that are missed, design accessibility issues, development issues, and when they're found by QA, it creates a big issue because you then have to circle back to how is this thing designed? You know, there are some things that do impact how it's designed. So the sooner you can identify how you're going to do things from an accessibility point of view, the better. And this is often the impact. So this poor QA person has multiple issues being fired at them, whereas if it's a team effort, you get a lot less, issues coming in, and everyone is responsible for tackling them. Another thing we get is you might have one accessibility specialist or accessibility orientated developer who ends up doing cleanup sprints, and this really isn't a good use of time. If they have to sort of spend all their time cleaning up other people's work, it's basically redoing work. Whereas actually, if you run some training and get all the developers creating things accessibly to start with, you get a lot more efficient process. We do come across people who are very sort of fixated on tools and will just use a tool. If it passes that tool, job done. That's it. The problem is tools cannot pick up everything. So it can't tell if you have appropriate alt text. So for anyone who can't see it, I've got a picture of a dog with an alt text of cat, and we've got a picture of a delete icon, a trash bin, with an alt text of button. So as a screen reader user, I would get an announcement of button. But what does it do? Apologies, my headset just turned off. So the if a tool can't pick that up and you're reliant on that tool, it's not going to be accessible. If you've got a good accessibility aware front-end developer, but not designers, you'll quite often get friction at that stage. So anytime a designer hands over to a front-end coder, this was an example we found when we were working with NHS Digital last year, that this design had come through from, I think, an external source, and the front-end developers were complaining it's way too complicated in terms of how the template structure was set up, the usability of it in some ways. And another example is things like drop-down lists. On the left-hand side, you've got browser default drop-down list. On the right-hand side, you have a fancy drop-down list. And the level of work needed between those two is very, very different. One is a couple of lines of HTML, and the other is substantial JavaScript, CSS, and put together in a particular way. So yeah, if you get friction at that stage, it means your designers need to know more about accessibility. I also come across some organizations who rely on a particular colleague, like Stefan's screen reader. And if you're reliant on that, it means that you're getting one very particular view of accessibility. And even within screen reader users, you get very different experience levels, differences between screen readers, for example. So this just is not sufficient in terms of handling accessibility in a systematic way. So moving up the maturity levels, where people have done training or some sort of accessibility work, they suddenly realize how much they've got to do. Their backlog fills up with things that they need to fix. So it is just a case of expect this is going to happen, and it's just a question of prioritization. So it's not expected that you have to fix everything at once. All that's expected is that you can create a roadmap to say, yep, on this, by this date, we'll have done a few of the basics, and then when we redesign the site, we'll have tackled everything else. So there's always a way that you can fit things in, prioritize, and just keep it moving. is the best advice. And then some people have legacy systems, and I did notice from Herman that the requirements are also for internal systems. So I think he means the public sector requirements that are used by employees. And actually, this legacy system is fairly typical in that sort of arena where there is just no way you're going to be able to update that system to be accessible. So in that case, and especially if it's for internal employees, you might need an alternative. So some other even business process to use. So somebody with disability can take a different route instead of having to use this particular application. It's not that you can suddenly use applications that aren't accessible and just worry about workarounds. It means if you've got old applications, that would be a good scenario. For anything you're procuring, that should be accessible. And it's just worth realizing, what a difference it makes. If you have to update things post-launch, it's going to cost way more than if you had accounted for it at the beginning. I think even if you don't account for things at design, it starts edging up in the development stage because you have to work around certain design aspects. But if you don't account for accessibility until after launch, it can mean redoing the whole front end. So whatever you spent doing the front end of the website, that is how much you might have to spend if you have to redevelop it. And it's not that accessibility costs that much, it's that redeveloping things cost that much. So I may have scared you, or maybe given some people a laugh in terms of, oh yeah, we've seen that in our company, or I saw that in my old company. But what do you do if you're trying to improve the situation? And there's a few things, and it very much depends where you are in the organization. But things that I would want to do top down is to set some board level responsibility. So somebody on the board, or whatever that kind of most senior layer is, has responsibility. They're not expert, they don't need to be expert, but they are where the buck stops, and they are a point of escalation. They should also be involved in setting team responsibilities. We want individuals to have targets for accessibility, and we need some kind of internal process to monitor that. And then also kind of bottom up from the people doing the work, it really helps to make sure people are trained, have understanding, can develop those skills. It also helps to have very granular responsibilities that I'll come on to. And also encouraging systematic design, pattern usage, code libraries, that sort of thing. In terms of getting buy-in, you'd be lucky if your CEO was like Tim Cook at Apple, who said during a shareholders call, I don't consider the bloody return on investment. But for most people, there are 5 things that execs care about. So it is very much a case of finding the right button. Is it increased market share from the roughly 20% of people in the Western world who have disabilities? Is it about efficiency from using systematic design and making sure accessibility is built into that systematic design? It might be legal compliance. That quite often works in the public sector. There might be another organizational strategy that you can slipstream accessibility into, or depending on the organization, they might respond to it just being the right thing to do. So know where you stand. This is a sort of important thing because you can't improve unless you know what the problems are. So getting some form of testing. And on screen, I put a spreadsheet that we created on a previous project where we were testing with an automated test, which was really good for finding areas of difference. So they've got various sections of the website, and the automated test really highlighted where the differences were between those sections. But the manual test found way more issues, just in terms of things like keyboard accessibility, is the structure appropriate, is the alt text appropriate, that sort of thing. So it's a case of, depending on the site, how big the site is, how complicated it is, um, you, some mix of methodologies for testing is useful there. And you can use that to analyze differences. So if you've got some areas that are better than others, why is that? Is it because of the content management system? Is it the team working on it knows more? Is it you've got one really hotshot developer who's very good at accessibility? What is it, and how can you get the other products to improve? And I was talking about granular responsibilities. So there are 50 content accessibility guidelines at level A and AA, but not everyone has to do all of them. So when we analysed a particular site, we found 10 that just didn't, these issues didn't come up. Just their general design and processes meant those issues never came up, so we put them to one side. There were 13 that the content designers needed to know about, 17 for the graphic designers, a bit more for the front-end coders, and then the testers did kind of have to know everything, unfortunately, but that is the way. But what it does mean is for your, say, content designers, people putting content into a content management system, they don't have to worry about everything. It's also really useful to customize the checklists. So this is a simpler version of the checklists that I use. Makes it easier for the teams, and we can also not include certain things if we don't need to. But it helps for teams to customize their own. There's some good research on the medical side where if you introduced a checklist, if the team didn't customize it to themselves, it wouldn't get used. But if they did customize it, even just a little bit, it made it work for them and it would actually get used. Training is obviously important, both in terms of empathy, why should we be doing this, but also skills, just in terms of knowing what references to use, where to get code from, and what things are required for these guidelines. And if you define how you do things, it makes it a lot easier. So for example, there's about 20 pages worth of stuff on headings in the guidelines. You don't need all that if you say, here's how our templates are set up and this is how we do headings. You can do it in 2 paragraphs. So if you go through that process, you will make life easier. And this is something we did, again, this is an NHS project we helped with, defining page structure, using headings. These were all done in a much simpler, more digestible way that was customized to the organization. And always try and set up feedback loops. So having your standard design patterns, brand guidelines, code libraries, even if they're not yours, specify someone else's. But what's really good is if you can learn things in a project and feed that back into those patterns and libraries. eBay is a good example of that. They've got their mind patterns, which is basically a sort of design pattern library with how eBay does things. And whatever component you're using, it has the accessibility stuff as part of that. And it really helps to have some kind of organizational structural support. So whether that's across product teams or across kind of different disciplines, having a group of people that meet, on roughly a monthly basis, possibly with an accessibility lead, but not necessarily, and reporting into a senior sponsor, just gives you a place to make sure that things are updated, that problems are addressed, and if teams need more support, there is an avenue for them to get it. So that was the accelerator bit. Find a sponsor, know where you stand, work out your responsibilities, run the training, and put in a process for updates. And once you've got that in place, a couple of things you might notice. Testing little and often really helps. So for example, sprint demos done without a mouse or trackpad, keyboard only. You'll notice more use of systematic design and more people wanting to use it because they don't want to be hamstrung by having 15 different versions of a button for example, or some kind of banner that have varying levels of accessibility. You want consistent design, consistent accessibility. I quite often see developers and testers coordinating their testing approaches. So the developers might use a Mac and the QA might use Windows just to get different coverage. And the good places where they really take it seriously tend to go beyond the guidelines. So they will work more from usability testing because all of the technical stuff has already been taken care of. And that's where you get to the sort of Zen stage. You know, it's like, oh, we found this interesting issue with our mapping feature that we hadn't seen before because we got this different kind of participant in. And they're pushing beyond the guidelines, you know, finding out more things and really, you know, moving the industry forward. And just in case we have some questions, I just want to leave you with just the knowledge that the bigger companies like your Microsofts, Googles, Apple are seeing accessibility as a commercial advantage. You know, this is the Xbox Accessible Remote Control, which was entirely set up for people with mobility impairments to play games. It means they can sell more Xboxes, and I believe, you know, because it's a very kind of flexible input mechanism, you can see there's lots of wires in the back. I think there's like 17 different inputs you can have in there, and it's good for people like DJs or others who need modified custom inputs. So that kind of wraps up everything I was planning to say. And so basically now we are open for questions. So if anyone has a question you I haven't answered or I haven't covered on accessibility, it is open season. Please type something into the Q&A, or if you'd like to, I can switch your talking on if you'd prefer to say it. So yeah, just let me know. And I will start with Ricky, who asked, what's my understanding of the distinctions between WCAG level A, AA, and AAA? Well, I had tried to answer that. Let me just pull up that particular slide. So either I didn't answer it well enough or something else. So essentially, level A are things that are known to be critical. So alt text, perfect example. If an important image didn't have alt text, that can stop somebody in their tracks. If something isn't keyboard focusable, you know, if the submit button on a form is not you can't tab to the submit button, that's going to stop some people in their tracks. So that tends to be the level A things. AA either means that it's not quite as big a barrier or that it's harder to achieve. And it's kind of the same further down for the AAA. So either it's something people can work around, or it's not applicable across all websites. So hopefully that answers your question. And then Magda's asking about tools I'd recommend to use. Yeah, there's lots of tools, and I do tend to forget. So as somebody who's worked in accessibility a long time, I tend to have just a sort of custom set of things that I use. So for example, I've got bookmarklets set up that will show kind of headings and landmarks and things like that. I use the web developer toolbar. I use certain things for demos. Wave is good, so that is wave.webaim.org. There is also, so this I would recommend for kind of spot checks. So things like if I just wanted to run a particular page, I'll probably get a different page than the one I'm used to, but I would use something like Wave, which will then give you kind of details on various things. Any of these tools still take some knowledge. So if you don't know what low contrast is or what redundant link text is, you either need to dig in or go away and kind of read the guidelines and work things out. But anyway, so that's good for spot checks. If I was doing an audit of the page, I wanted tool support. There is a Microsoft, what do they call it? I'm just gonna, sorry for a bit of live Googling. Accessibility Insights is a Edge/Chrome plugin that will take you through the kind of process of doing a full test of a page. This has an even bigger caveat around you need to know what it's telling you. You need to have that understanding. But those are the kind of two tools I would point to for that kind of review. If you're doing more kind of if you're an internal person wanting to kind of spider your whole website, I'd use something like SortSite, SortSite. And if you are a developer who wants something to integrate with their build process, I'd probably look at Tenon or something like that. I can be completely agnostic on this because we don't produce a tool ourselves. Herman's asking, it's important to note the requirements are also for internal web-based systems. Yeah, I think I covered that one. Most companies concentrate only on the internet websites to their clients. So yes, if you have intranets, if you have tools that you use internally, they should also be accessible and have an accessibility statement. Sharon says, thank you, that was great. Thank you, Sharon. Anonymous attendee asks, the best tool for screen reading? Sorry, headset goes again. The best tool for screen reading is, well, it depends on your platform. What I would be very careful about is thinking that you're a screen reader user. It takes a lot of practice to get good at a screen reader, and also practice that you do without looking at the screen. So you really need to understand the keyboard shortcuts, the and how you use your computer without looking at the screen. So if you're on a Mac, you have one built in. It's called VoiceOver. Use that with Safari because that browser tends to work best with that. And if you are on Windows, I would generally recommend NVDA. So if I remember where that is. Yeah, nvaccess.org. So this is a free one, although I do recommend donating. It's literally run by two guys and it competes with JAWS, which is about £800. So free or £800. It'd be worth giving them a donation. And that one works, and I would say it's roughly on par with JAWS as well, at least for web content. JAWS does tend to do better at things like Office. Chromevox is also available if as a plugin to Chrome, but it does work quite differently from the others, and I don't come across a lot of end users who actually use it. In terms of, sorry, Anonymous asks, in terms of budget, what do you think would be the minimum spend we've been making sure a site is compliant? It very much depends on the site. So if it was an internal team very knowledgeable about accessibility to the point where they could write their own accessibility statement, it wouldn't cost anything. If you're getting a third party to do something and you're not sure if they know enough about accessibility, then I would recommend getting that tested. So especially for doing accessibility statements, how big a test that is, we tend to do audits in the kind of 5 to 20 page sort of thing, depending on the site. So if you had like a 50-page website, but there's only like 5 different kinds of template or content, then that, you know, you could probably cover that in 5 pages. You know, we can cover 1,000-page websites, you know, 10 to 20 pages, but it purely depends on how many different types of content and template there are on the site. And in terms of, if you were talking about the actual development budget, again, if you do it from the start, you're not going to notice a difference. If you have to do it at the end, you're going to notice a big difference. So I think I've done these. Natalie asks, what's the tool that highlighted the marked up sections? Oh yeah, okay. So that was just the access bookmarklet. Yeah, let's help. Accessibility bookmarklets. There we go. These are just little bookmarklets that you can copy into your kind of toolbar up here, and then it will do the highlights for you. And in some ways, I find this is better than using a screen reader yourself, because it means that you're looking at it and working out what's appropriate. You're not struggling with using a screen reader. Unless you really do put the time into practice with it, you could actually make things worse with what you think is going to make things better. Right, I need to get rid of ones that have been done. Chris Smith asks, I read that WCAG levels apply on a per page basis rather than for a whole site. Is this right? And what constitutes a page in modern single page web apps? Very good question. And this is rooted in essentially the when WCAG 2 was written around 2005, 6, 7, released in 2008. So what constitutes a page in a modern single page app? Essentially, most of them will now actually change URLs. So this is less of an issue than it used to be. But even if it doesn't change URLs, you'll have different views. So it does depend on, you know, how many templates, different kind of layouts and things you have, whether you've got, you know, tables, listings, video content. So that's the kind of basis that you're looking to take a sample from. And obviously, as I said a minute ago, if you've got a 1,000-page website, it doesn't help to audit 900 pages that are exactly the same, apart from different words in the page. So we take a sample, and that's a generally kind of agreed way of doing things. I think that's done. Ricky asks, do you tend to focus more on web pages or components that may occur across pages? That's very much a question of how you take your sample. So yes, you want to cover all the components. I've even had clients chuck literally all of their components into one page. It took a little bit longer than one page, but than one page typically would. But that is not a bad thing. What I would focus on though is it does help to get the live realistic pages, so components in context, because there are certain things that will vary depending on the actual context that component is used in, like heading levels. And how is automated accessibility testing done? Any audit tools? So it depends. Automated is either done per page or with something like a site spider. I think, as I mentioned before, things like site sort will spider a website for you and check for issues, with the huge caveat that it's only going to find 30 to 40% of the issues. Whereas something like Tenon is good for kind of per page tests or build process tests. And there are also things like Core accessibility testing. So this is a free one. which again, if you're sort of on the developer side, is useful. It does have a zero false positives kind of approach, which does mean it's not trying to check for as much as it could. Anything which isn't definitely an issue, it's not going to flag, which sounds good, but then it's going to find less things than a tool like SiteSort would. So SiteSort will give you more information. Axe will just focus on things it knows are issues.
Alastair, sorry for interrupting you, but there was another very good question.
Okay.
That was asked by Stephen. He asked, can accessibility improve the online shopping experience for everyone? And if I want to get started with accessibility, where should I start?
Yes, it can improve it for everyone, so long as you take a kind of almost a user-centered approach. In terms of making sure things are easy to use, combining usability testing, possibly with people with disabilities, but also regular members of the public. So that helps. Where should I start? That was basically what the second half of the presentation was about. Unfortunately, I don't know your situation, but if you're not sure, I would start with training. And possibly knowing where you stand in terms of getting like an accessibility audit that just tells you where you stand at the moment, essentially. And have I seen any great examples of online accessibility? In general, I'd say GovUK does a good job. The BBC do a good job. And these are two organizations which have in-house accessibility teams. So it's not just a case of they happen to have done a good job, they have internal processes. Those teams are small teams, but they work with a huge number of designers and developers, and they work on the process of how the BBC and GovUK put sites together. That makes a huge difference. One example I would generally point out, and there are always issues and caveats with any example, but John Lewis, we worked with a couple of years ago, and hands down had the fewest issues of any e-commerce site that we have tested. Although I would say, actually, I think EasyJet have also done quite a good job. And it's particularly difficult with orange and white. So I'm not entirely sure about their color contrast, but if you start tabbing through the page, you can easily book a flight without using your mouse. So yeah, that's sort of one good example for that specific thing, one generally good example, and two examples where it's all about the internal teams and the process. Any other questions? Oh, thank you, Siobhan. PDF links on websites, how to correctly integrate this. I can't pass this on the Wave tool. So for PDF links, I'm trying to think of an example. I can't think of an example offhand, but let's see how GovUK does it. Now, it is worth mentioning that GovUK have a standing kind of policy on not using PDFs. So it's entirely possible I won't find one. But if in general, okay, let me just answer this off the top of my head then. So the user needs to know that it's going to a PDF and ideally what the file size is as well. So I would generally say it needs to have if this was our link, it needs to have a like brackets PDF 38K or 3 megabytes or whatever it is. So oh, we need to round it up. We may get knocked off. So just in case this all comes to an abrupt end, thank you very much, everyone. I will stick around and answer some questions. up until the point we get knocked off, basically. So for Zana, yeah, to integrate it, include the term PDF and ideally the file size in the link text. You can replace that with an icon that's got appropriate alt text, but I would have thought either of those approaches would pass the Wave tool. Stephen, do I advise against using PDFs? In general, yes. Now, technically, PDFs can be made as accessible as kind of web HTML content, but they're generally not. And the reason they're not is that it's far easier to make a website accessible going through, say, a content management system, because everyone's using the same interface and you can lock down that interface. So you have to use lists, you have to do things in certain ways, whereas a PDF can come from anywhere. Design documents, Word, Excel, PowerPoint, all those sorts of things. So it is very much a case of there's so much variety, and everyone creating the PDF and even the source content needs to know how to make both the source content accessible and how to make an accessible PDF. The bar is so much higher, it just doesn't generally get done. So yes, that is why I would advise against PDFs. And if you look up the PDF accessibility, where is it? Yeah, they have a kind of a general policy on WCAG content should be published in HTML and not PDF. And there's various reasons, but I think that's one of them. Oh, and thank you, Natalie. You're welcome. And have I ever had the example where the brand colors of an organization are completely against the WCAG guidelines? Yes, long time ago, we did some work for lastminute.com, which uses pink and white. And it's not so much that yeah, so but even with pink and white as the brand guidelines, they obviously use a lot of black. They use some generally quite contrasting text. So you have a general exception for logos. So any kind of logo that we're looking at, the actual logo itself doesn't need to meet the contrast guidelines, but the text does, and actually certain graphics, other graphics do as well now. So in general, even if the brand colors don't meet it, you can produce a good website that meets the brand guidelines and the accessibility guidelines. You just have to be very careful. Oh, thank you, Dave. And done that one. Did I miss anything in the chat? Oh, lots of thank yous.
Yeah, I think you've answered all the questions that we had in the Q&A, and also in the chat, everyone who posted a question there added that to the Q&A panel. So I think we just have to say thank you, Alastair.
Oh, Chris has just snuck in. Last question.
Oh, yeah.
Is there a list of safe fonts which are more readable? Not particularly. Things that are designed for screen, like Verdana and some of the recent Microsoft fonts, do tend to be quite readable. The main thing I would point out, especially from a WCAG point of view, is actually users can override the font. So if I click on this plugin, this is theoretically a dyslexic friendly font. There is some dispute about whether that actually makes any difference, but users can override your fonts. And what's even, sorry, and the way that we approach that from a WCAG point of view is there is a text spacing guideline, so that if you can apply that text spacing, which has got certain word spacing, letter spacing, etc., then your site should be robust to different fonts and different spacing that the user can do themselves. So you don't necessarily have to worry too much about the font you're using, so long as the users can override it. So yeah, thank you very much. Thanks to everyone who attended. Obviously, we are a commercial company with accessibility services. Feel free to get in touch. But I hope everyone found that useful, and thank you very much.